a man walks through the stone gates of Jerusalem, dust coating his leather sandals after a journey of nearly 900 miles. He is exhausted. Earliest accounts at the specific Greek verbs used. At a strange, almost invisible parenthetical note dropped into the Gospel of Mark. And at a limestone. People never actually existed. They argued that, confidently, right up until the mid-20th century, until archaeologists started digging in the Kidron Valley. Just outside the old city walls, the year is 1941. An archaeologist named Eliezer Sukenik is standing in a newly discovered burial cave in the Kidron Valley. Just east of the walls of Jerusalem, the air inside the cavern is damp. It smells of ancient, undisturbed earth. His metal trowel scrapes gently against hard limestone. As he clears away the dirt of 20 centuries, he is looking at a collection of Jewish ossuaries. An ossuary is a stone bone box. The burial practice was highly specific and historically brief. When someone died in the 1st century, they were placed in a rock-hewn tomb until the flesh completely decayed. A year later, the family would return to the dark cavern to gather the dry bones and place them into a small limestone box to save space. This specific secondary burial practice only existed in Jerusalem for a very narrow window of history, roughly from 20 BC until the Romans burned the city to the ground in 70 AD. Finding an ossuary means you have found a locked vault from the exact decades Jesus walked the earth. Sukenik brushes the heavy, wet clay from the side of one particular box. There are faint, hurried etchings scratched into the pale stone. They are written in both Greek and Hebrew letters. It is the kind of practical, unpolished engraving a grieving family leaves behind in the dark. The burial box pulled from the dirt in a valley outside Jerusalem, you start to see something. The random accident reading completely misses. The inscription reads, Alexander, son of Simon. By itself, that is interesting but not definitive. Alexander and Simon were incredibly common names in the ancient Mediterranean. Finding them together in a Jerusalem tomb could be a statistical anomaly, a coincidence in the dirt. But Sukenik keeps clearing the dust. There is one more word etched deeply into the side of the limestone, designating the family's origin so they would not be forgotten in a foreign land. Cyrene, Alexander, son of Simon, of Cyrene, buried in a 1st century Jerusalem tomb. The archaeological consensus is staggering. The statistical probability of another family with exactly these names, originating from exactly this specific North African city, burying a son in Jerusalem during this exact 90-year window of time, is practically zero. You can trace the fingerprints of this family directly from the blood-stained limestone of Golgotha to the ink of Mark's papyrus, to the wax seals of Paul's letter, straight down into the dust of the Kidron Valley. The names in the text are not a theological metaphor. They are a historical footprint. They were real people who breathed the dust of the Roman roads. They were a family who watched their entire generational trajectory altered by a single, terrifying spear tap from an imperial legionary. The empire tried to use the father as a disposable laborer on a Friday morning, but the earth itself held onto the bones of the son to prove the story was true. But long before his bones were placed in a stone box, Simon of Cyrene is not a prop. He is a patriarch. The brief, violent collision between his life and the cross of Christ was, long before his sons became recognized leaders in the imperial capital. The father had to survive the trauma of the execution. The sun is low on the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the limestone of Golgotha. The execution is over. The soldiers are gathering their iron tools. The crowd is fracturing, spilling back down the steep paths toward the city gates, murmuring in confusion and terror. The sky is dark. Simon turns his back on the cross. He walks down the hill. His shoulders ache with a dull, throbbing intensity. His tunic is stiff with the dried blood of the Galilean. His hands, usually clean for the holy festival, are stained with dirt and sweat. He walks through the narrow streets of the lower city. The Passover lamps are beginning to flicker in the small, open windows, Families are gathering. He can hear the chanting of the Hallel Psalms, spilling out of the doorways. He is ritually impure. He cannot join them. He cannot eat the roasted lamb. The high holy day he traveled a month to observe has been ruined by the brutal interruption of the empire. He pushes open the wooden door to his rented room. His wife looks up. His young sons, Alexander and Rufus, are sitting by the small fire. Not just a passing detail recorded to show how physically broken Jesus was. It was an origin story. It was the moment a family tree. They see his torn clothes. They see the blood. They see the physical shock radiating from his chest. He sits down on the hard floor. He begins to speak. He tells them about the spear tap in the crowded street. He tells them about the weight of the rough pine. He tells them about the jagged rocks of the execution path. But he also tells them about the man he walked beside. He tells them about the ragged, failing breath of the rabbi. He tells them how the man did not curse the soldiers. He tells them what the man said when the spikes tore through the flesh. He did not walk into that room with a fully formed theology of the atonement. He walked in with a broken heart and a terrifying memory. He thought he had lost the Passover. He thought he had been robbed of the sacrifice. He did not yet realize that he was one of the only men in human history to physically carry the wood for the true Lamb of God. He did not yet know that the blood drying on his skin was the blood that would wash the world clean. The empire forced a burden onto his back, believing they were destroying his dignity. They were actually handing him his legacy. This is the pattern, was violently uprooted and planted in entirely new soil. To feel the weight of what actually happens to him on that Friday morning, of the divine invasion. God rarely asks for volunteers. He disrupts. He interrupts our carefully planned religious calendars with a brutal, heavy reality that we did not choose and cannot control. And we are left standing on the road, staring at the cross we have been handed. We are a species that loves the idea of the cross, as long as we are the ones who get to choose it. We prefer our sacrifices to be manageable, aesthetically pleasing, and worn strictly on our own terms. A polished silver pendant resting lightly against the collarbone. A quiet morning of devotion anchored by a warm cup of coffee. A scheduled moment of charity where we control the itinerary, the environment, and the exit strategy. We want the spiritual optics of the cross without the splintered pine tearing into our skin. But the Angaru of the empire does not work like that. True transformation rarely arrives politely. It does not wait for a gap in your schedule. It comes like a spear tap in a crowded street when you were just trying to survive the day. And it forces a weight onto your back that you never agreed to carry. It is the phone ringing at 2 in the morning, flooding your mouth with the metallic taste of adrenaline. It is the cold, fluorescent-lit linoleum of a hospital waiting room, have to step into the noise of the occupied capital. It is early. The sun is barely rising over the Mount of Olives. But it is the sharp sting of a legal document sliding across a desk. It is the sudden, suffocating weight of a grief you cannot put down, or a betrayal you never saw coming. When that weight drops onto your shoulders, the immediate human reflex is to see it as a tragic distraction. You think it is ruining your life's pilgrimage. You assume you are in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in the collateral damage of a violently broken world. You try to shake off the tap on the shoulder. You plead with the sky to be left alone, in the anonymity of the crowd. But this is where the historical reality of Simon dismantles our modern theology of convenience. The burden you are carrying is not an accident of geography. It is a conscription. God frequently uses the brutal, unchosen interruptions of our lives to pull us into a proximity with Jesus that we would never have agreed to on our own. Simon of Cyrene would never have walked up to a Roman execution squad and volunteered to carry the timber. He had to be forced into the blood, the sweat, and the dirt. And yet, that forced, terrifying proximity changed the trajectory of his entire bloodline. It turned a passing pilgrim into a patriarch of the early church. We spend so much of our lives trying to avoid the heavy wood. We try to stay ritually clean. We try to preserve our neatly planned religious experiences. Festival crowds are already awake, pressing into the narrow, suffocating alleys. The city's population has swollen to triple its normal size. The atmosphere is tense. We want the singing choirs of the temple, not the fly-covered rocks of the execution hill. But God does not do his most permanent work in the sterile, comfortable courts of our expectations. He meets us on the dirt roads, under the crushing weight of the things we begged him to take away. And when you zoom out to look at the entire scope of the biblical narrative, you realize Simon is not the only one. A man traveled 900 miles to offer a sacrifice, and he carried the timber for the final one. A soldier tapped a stranger for disposable labor, and he conscripted a patriarch for the early church. A pilgrim was defiled by a dying rabbi's blood, and that blood washed his entire lineage clean. A writer dropped 2 obscure names onto expensive papyrus, and those names became pillars in the imperial capital. An apostle lost his biological family for the gospel and found a mother in the wife of a cross-bearer. A grieving family scratched a name into soft limestone, and the earth held it safe for 20 centuries. The empire forced a splintered beam onto a broken man, and God used it to alter history. One thread, one story, volatile. Heavily policed by Roman guards holding spears and standing on the fortress walls. Simon is just walking into the city from the country. But maybe the part that stays with me most is the letter to Rome. A Jewish woman from North Africa, washing the iron scent of a crucified stranger's blood out of her husband's tunic by the flickering light of an olive oil lamp, having no idea that decades later, she would be breaking warm bread for the Apostle Paul. She did not reject the trauma her husband brought home. She built a sanctuary out of it. If you are in a season where the weight on your shoulders feels entirely unchosen, if you feel like your life was interrupted by a spear tap you never saw coming, and you are sweating under a burden you cannot put down, do not assume you are just a random casualty of a broken world. The weight on your back is not a tragic accident. It is a holy conscription, and may the God who meets us on the dirt roads, under the crushing weight of the wood, walk with you on the steepest climbs, and use the burden you never chose to build a legacy you could never imagine, likely trying to secure a place for the evening meal. He doesn't know who the bleeding man in the street is. If this reached something in you, subscribe. Leave a comment. Even one word helps. Share this with someone who is carrying an unexpected cross right now. Pray for us as we keep digging into these texts. He doesn't know the late-night politics of the high priests or the political cowardice of the Roman governor. He is simply a man who, the air is thick. You can smell roasting meat, unwashed bodies, and the sharp scent of wood smoke hanging over the crowded, winding streets, turns a corner and finds himself staring at a line of soldiers. He is in the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. At least, that is what it feels like. But the soldier stepping toward him is not asking for volunteers. Mark chapter 15, verse 21 sets the scene. Jesus is bleeding out on the limestone pavement. The Roman execution squad, operating on a strict military timetable, realizes their prisoner is going into hypovolemic shock. He will not survive the uphill march to Golgotha. The centurion needs a solution, and he scans the dense wall of bodies lining the street. He locks eyes with a strong-looking foreigner in the Passover crowd and points a finger. The English translations often soften the violence of this exchange. They simply tell us the soldiers compelled or forced a passerby to carry the cross. The word mark actually puts on the parchment is much sharper. It is the Greek verb angarioo. It appears only 3 times in the entire New Testament, and it is a word that carries the heavy, suffocating dread of an occupied nation. It is a loan word originally taken from the ancient Persian Empire. Originally, it described a royal courier's legal right to commandeer a horse from any local citizen to ensure a state message was delivered on time. By the 1st century, the Romans had adopted and weaponized the practice. Under Roman military law, a legionary had the absolute authority to tap any subjugated civilian. He has traveled from Cyrene, a thriving coastal city in North Africa, and he has likely spent a year's wages just to make the voyage, on the shoulder, with the flat of his spear, and force them to carry military gear. It was the ultimate display of dominance. There was no appeal process. There was no negotiation. You drop your personal belongings in the dirt. You submit to the empire. It is the exact same verb Jesus used years earlier, on a Galilean hillside. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus tells a crowd of poor farmers, "If anyone forces you angaruo to go 1 mile, go with him too." He was directly addressing the trauma of Roman occupation. He was naming the daily terror of the spear tap. And now, staggering under the weight of his own execution, that exact imperial law is triggered right beside him. That single Greek root changes how we read Simon's entry into the biblical narrative. Simon did not step forward out of pity. This was not a voluntary act of compassion. It was a brutal, public humiliation. Imagine the sensory shock. Simon has traveled hundreds of miles to celebrate the holiest festival of his faith. He has likely saved silver coins for years for this exact trip. But the moment his bare hands grip the splintered, blood-soaked pine of a Roman execution stake, everything changes. He becomes ritually defiled. He cannot eat the blag, Passover lamb tonight. His religious pilgrimage is instantly destroyed. He is suddenly covered in the sweat and blood of a condemned political rebel, marching toward a skull-shaped hill surrounded by hostile guards. His presence on that road is not a divine invitation. It is a state-sponsored trauma. He is a diaspora Jew coming home for the holiest week of the calendar. He expects the solemnity of the Passover sacrifice, but the empire does not realize what it is actually doing. The Romans think they are just conscripting a laborer to keep an execution on schedule, but the detail that changes this entire story is what happens after the wood drops onto his back. The wood hits his shoulder. The rough pine tears through his tunic. The sudden, immense weight pulls him down into the dirt. He finds his footing. He pushes up against the gravity of the timber. The march begins. The crowd presses in on every side. The Roman guards shout guttural commands. The morning sun beats down on the back of his neck. He does not know this, Jesus. He only knows the fresh, sticky blood smearing across his own skin. He only knows the smell of sweat, iron, and terror. He only knows the sound of weeping women trailing closely behind them in the dust. The limestone pavement is uneven. The path is relentlessly steep. Every single step is a negotiation with gravity. He feels the jagged edge of the patibulum, the heavy horizontal crossbeam digging deep into his collarbone. He hears the breathing of the condemned man stumbling beside him. The breaths are ragged. They are shallow. They are failing. This is not a sacred procession. It is a death march. They move past the merchants. They move past the city gates. He expects the temple choirs singing the psalms of ascent, echoing off the massive white stones of the Temple Mount. They leave the holy city behind and walk out into the barren, unforgiving rock of the execution grounds. The rich smell of Passover fires fades. The cold stench of blood and fly-covered rock replaces it. Simon is trapped in the center of the spectacle for hundreds of miles. He dreamed of carrying a spotless yearling lamb to the gleaming temple altar. He dreamed of the singing priests. He dreamed of the bronze basin. He dreamed of the holy incense filling the courts. Instead, he is carrying a Roman slaughtering block. Instead of ascending the marble temple steps, he climbs a skull-shaped hill of execution. Instead of presenting a holy sacrifice, he participates in a state murder. The procession finally halts. The soldiers rip the beam from his bleeding back. They throw the Galilean to the ground. They align his wrists over the wood. They raise the heavy iron spikes. You can hear the hammer strike the metal. You can hear the sound echo off the limestone walls. Simon stands in the dirt, chest heaving, watching the cross get hoisted up against the sky. He is covered in the blood of an absolute stranger. He has fulfilled his conscripted duty. The empire requires nothing more of him. He is legally free to walk away. He can find a ritual bath. He can wash the defilement from his skin. He can vanish forever into the endless sea of Passover pilgrims. What he gets instead is a Roman execution. Most people read the story of Simon of Cyrene as a random, unfortunate encounter. He is meant to be forgotten. But there is a detail hiding in plain sight. Mark refuses to let him disappear. When the Gospel of Mark was finally written down, maybe 30 or 40 years after the blood dried on the limestone of Golgotha, the author did something strange. Mark is the shortest, the fastest, and the most breathless of all the four Gospels. He does not waste words. He cuts out the entire birth narrative of Jesus. He skips the long, soaring theological sermons that Matthew and John include. He writes in a rapid-fire Greek style where almost every scene starts with the word immediately. Every single syllable he presses into the papyrus is expensive. And yet, right in the middle of the most chaotic, fast-paced execution scene in ancient literature, Mark pauses the narrative to give us a family tree. He writes in Mark chapter 15, verse 21, "A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross." The father of Alexander and Rufus. If something about this tiny, easily skipped detail is stirring up questions you've never considered, you're exactly who this channel is for. Drop a thought in the comments and hit subscribe, because every week we go deeper into the text than you knew was possible. When we picture the road to Golgotha, we see this man as a cinematic extra, a nameless, unlucky face pulled from a chaotic mob. So, Mark drops these two names onto the page. Why? Why would an author who refuses to give us the names of the shepherds at the manger or the name of the boy with the 5 loaves and 2 fish suddenly care about the teenage sons of a North African pilgrim? In the ancient world, you only named secondary characters in a historical account for one of 2 reasons. Either they were famous or they were your sources. Mark is not wasting expensive parchment. He is naming living witnesses. When this gospel was first read aloud in the house churches of the Roman Empire, the room quieted by the flickering light of olive oil lamps, the audience would have recognized that parenthesis instantly. They did not need an explanation of who Alexander and Rufus were. They knew them. They knew their faces. They had likely shared the unleavened bread of communion with them. Simon the Passover pilgrim did not just carry a piece of wood and disappear back into the anonymity of North Africa. He went home to his family, his hands still calloused from the rough pine, his clothes still carrying the metallic scent of a stranger's blood. And he told his wife and his sons what happened on the hill. He told them how the man on the cross died, and those 2 boys grew up to become pillars of the early Christian movement. But that echo does not stop in the Gospel of Mark. To carry the heavy, splintered wood when Jesus of Nazareth finally collapses in the dirt, we read right past his name to get to. A man paces across a cold stone floor in Corinth. The winter wind rattles the wooden shutters. A scribe sits near a flickering olive oil lamp. The scribe dips a split reed pen into dark soot ink. The tip scratches violently against the rough papyrus. The man pacing is the Apostle Paul. He is dictating the final chapter of his letter to the church in Rome. He is wrapping up the most dense, world-altering theological document ever composed. But before the hot wax seals the scroll, he begins to list names. He names the tent makers. He names the prisoners. He names the former slaves. The ink dries. The list stretches out. 26 specific individuals. He is connecting the scattered dots of the underground church. Then he speaks, verse 13. "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord. Rufus, the son of Simon, the boy named in the Gospel of Mark, the son of the man who hauled the heavy pine up the hill of Golgotha." He is no longer just a boy in Cyrene. He has grown into a recognized, beloved leader in the very capital of the empire that crucified the Messiah. But Paul does not stop there. He dictates one more line. "And his mother, who has been a mother to me." 2. Simon's wife. Picture her. A Jewish woman from North Africa. Decades earlier, her husband had stumbled back to their Passover lodging in Jerusalem, trembling, his hands blistered, his tunic stained with the blood of a crucified rabbi, the climax of the crucifixion. We assume he is a historical prop, a convenient accident of geography. But if you look closer at the She washed the iron scent of blood from his clothes. She listened to him try to explain the darkness that fell over the city. She did not just believe his story. She built an entirely new life on it. She became a pillar of the early movement. She opened her doors. She became a surrogate mother to the man who wrote half the New Testament. Paul had lost everything to follow Jesus. He had lost his elite status, his Pharisee colleagues, and likely his own biological family. He was a man constantly hunted, beaten, and shipwrecked. He was orphaned by his own convictions. He needed a refuge. He found it with the family of the cross-bearer. She likely poured warm oil on his scarred back. She broke warm bread for his journeys. She held his face in her hands and prayed over his exhausted, brilliant mind. The Roman centurion on the streets of Jerusalem thought he was just conscripting a temporary laborer. He was actually recruiting the family that would nurse, the greatest apostle of the early church. Simon's conscription was not a random tragedy. It was the violent planting of a generational seed. A spear tap in Jerusalem became a sanctuary in Rome. But for centuries, secular critics have argued that these names are just a clever literary device. They argue that Simon, Alexander, and Rufus are simply fictions, invented by the gospel writers to make a theological point about carrying your cross. They claim these